There we go. While that is getting launched, I am pleased to announce that this webinar will be recorded and will become part of the series of webinars that we host on the very rich barnahus.eu website. So if you have any questions or concerns about that, you can write me in the chat, or you can send me an email later. While there's still some people getting joined, I'll just introduce. If we haven't met yet, I recognize almost all of the names in this call, but if we haven't met, I'm Shauna von Blixen. I'm the coordinator of the Promise Barnahus Network. We're so glad to have so many of you joining us today for what will no doubt be a very interesting presentation and conversation with our colleagues from Child Circle. I will let them introduce themselves, but I'll just briefly introduce, in case you're not familiar with our Promise projects that we are running right now. We have a current stream of EU funding that is coming to an end in just a few days. And that's where this webinar falls under. And it is part of quite many EU co-funded projects that we have that are working to enable exchange of knowledge and practice on all kinds of very practical day-to-day and also more high-level application of EU legal safeguards and everything else in between and beyond. So without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce to you Rebecca O'Donnell, who is one of the co-founders of Child Circle. And she's also a member of the Promise Barnahus Network Steering Group. And also Sylvia Randazzo. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Shauna. And hello to everybody. Really nice to see some familiar faces, some new faces. As Shauna said, I'm Rebecca O'Donnell. I'm an Irish lawyer based in Brussels in Child Circle. And Sylvia Randazzo is a colleague who is working with me on Promise 3 in this last stretch of Promise 3, I should put it more accurately. Sylvia and I first met when we were working together on another project called Focus, which was led by Terezum and included some of the Promise partners, in particular Child Circle and SAPI. So we're going to mention Focus, and I'm thrilled that Sylvia can join today. I'm going to try and share screens. It always seems like such a scary moment. I don't know whether anyone else has a similar fear.
I'm here for you.
Oh, thank you. That's the best. Perfect. Back up. Now, I am going to go into from beginning.
We can see it. So that's
okay.
That's a good step one.
Perfect.
There we go.
And you can still hear me. Okay.
Perfectly.
Thank you so much. So as Shauna explained, this is part of the Promise 3 project. And of course, we are really pleased to have co-funding from the EU for this project. The subject we will look at are individual assessments for child victims and the Barnahus. So it is really in the guise of a conversation. I'll obviously open up some of the issues that we want to look at, but we would invite you to put questions, remarks in the chat as we go. And then, of course, we will hope to have a space for a conversation towards the end of the presentation. That being said, if anything I say isn't clear, please do raise your hand and just ask for immediate clarification. So if there's a stumbling block or in something I've said. What are we going to look at together? We kind of divided this into 4 parts. Just a first very simple point, what are we talking about when we say individual assessments, and what are individual assessments in the Barnahus for? Then we're going to zoom out. We're going to look at individual assessments as a tool in criminal justice proceedings. And perhaps we could say more accurately, as an obligation for states to carry out in criminal justice proceedings. Shauna mentioned that we link our work with the EU directives, which provide a common framework for most of us, and an inspiration for others in terms of our work together. So there is an obligation, as we'll see, under EU law to conduct an individual assessment when a child is a victim of crime. We're then going to step into the focus standards. These are standards that emanated from our project, where we were part of our project, which was called Focus on My Needs. So we were focusing in on the needs of child victims, and in fact also child suspects in criminal justice proceedings. And there we developed some standards as a tool for improving individual assessments and improving the system for carrying them out, and also the case management. And finally, love to get back into the territory of the Barnahus and see, how can we better design our individual assessment processes, or how can we better use them in the Barnahus? And that is very much the start of a conversation that we'll take forward in our other projects. We will also be following up on this webinar with a reflections paper on individual assessments. So that will also serve as a resource, we hope. So stepping into what we mean by individual assessments. And let's just, again, remember where we are. Of course, the Barnahus is all about putting the child at the center of the proceedings. So everything we do is to really ensure that procedural safeguards are put in place for child victims, that they have access to child protection measures, that they have access to the physical and mental health services that they need. So, key to our practice are in fact individual assessments, even if we don't always name them that way. So what happens to a child in Barnahus to make it child-centered has to be informed by a proper assessment of the circumstances of each individual child, with a view to identifying and meeting their specific needs. So we have child-centered practice in general. We have designed our processes so that they are generally child-centered. But obviously, in relation to each child, we need to stop and look at what their situation is and what their needs are, so we can respond to them. This is all, of course, immensely familiar territory to anyone involved in Barnahus. But when we think down a little bit to, how we do this, we run into a number of practical questions. And this is the great value of the Promise Barnahus Network and our projects, because we can kind of delve into these practical questions and stop and pause and see whether we're doing things right, can we improve them? So, and I should have said at the outset that I think, Shauna, I may be wrong, but I'm trying to think of the exact date when we previously had a professional networking exchange on individual assessments. I think it goes back to 2021, March.
I think so,
Yeah. So we're probably 2 years on, but when we were in the beginning phases of this project, we started off by kind of flagging the issue of individual assessments and having a professional network exchange. And some of you participated already in that exchange, and also a survey we sent out to members to learn a bit more about the individual assessments. So in that kind of exchange, and as we were surveying, we were thinking about individual assessments and saying, to what extent is a child's circumstances and needs assessed before they come into the Barnahus, or at the Barnahus, or both, and how systematic and comprehensive are our individual assessments? What sources of information do we take into account to learn about the situation of the child? And how is the child informed and engaged in relation to these assessments. So again, more questions, and of course there are others besides these, but kind of key. To what extent are the assessments really being used to help children access their rights? And of course, how do the professionals benefit from all the information gathered, in terms of discharging their own roles? Obviously, kind of understanding the situation of the child is vital to really coordinating the different processes involving the child. So the individual assessment should indeed be one of the embedded in the whole case management. And of course, another question, and that's something we're also thinking about in the context of other projects, which we'll mention, is, how do our processes in the Barnahus connect with professionals outside the Barnahus, whether that's before children come in or after the Barnahus, as it were. So that's just the kind of context when we think of individual assessments and Barnahus. They're the kind of general questions that might spring to our mind. And now going to the part where we just want to step back outside of the Barnahus, just to the situation where we're thinking about children who are victims and who are involved in criminal justice proceedings. And let's just see what the obligation is in relation to them broadly under EU laws. And this will allow us to consider the broader picture and make sure that our practice in Barnahus does indeed root in these legal obligations. It's good for people to know. This isn't just something we do because it's useful, it's helpful, but we're also required to do it. And that's important. And then, of course, we want to, in that context of the broader picture, look at the guiding principles we developed in Focus, which we think can benefit reflections in the Barnahus as well. And as you'll see, obviously those standards were also developed with the Barnahus practices in mind. It doesn't come as any surprise to anyone that in Europe, in any discussion now, Barnahus is kind of almost at the top of the list in terms of good practices. So what directives are relevant? There are, and I don't want to take us into, arid legal ground, but just to give us our reference points, there are two key directives involved. Maybe the order of these two should be reversed in date order. In 2011, a directive addressing child sexual abuse, including obligations to support and protect and assist children, was adopted by the EU. And it very specifically notes that states have to take these specific actions to assist and support child victims, ensuring that they enjoy their rights following an individual assessment. And a year later, a more general directive on victims' rights, so victims going beyond child sexual abuse victims, and that also notes that a child victim, and obviously it wasn't focusing only on children, but there were provisions that also were tailored to children. So there's a general provision that victims of crime should receive a timely and individual assessment to identify their protection needs and to determine whether and to what extent they benefit from specific measures. So as you can see, these are general, broad obligations that states should implement at national level, put into place. Just putting a flag down, there is a proposal to for a new EU directive concerning child sexual abuse online and offline. So in due course, we will see how those provisions are further developed. And the same is true of the Victims' Rights Directive. The Commission is expected to propose a revision of the Victims' Rights Directive. And just one thing we'd like to see added to the individual assessment obligation is something we already see in an obligation that exists at EU level in relation to child suspects and accused of crime. In other words, for child suspects and accused of crime, you also have to do an individual assessment of their needs. But it specifically says in the EU legislation that this should be, as far as possible, a multidisciplinary individual assessment. And of course, that's again, very much in spirit with international law. And, you know, it's something that may well come into focus. So this is a little bit of an X-ray into, you know, what do those obligations say at EU level? I mean, and again, as I said, they're broad. And these two kind of side by side, these aren't competing provisions. These are provisions that apply when a child is a victim of a crime. And also the 2011 is specifically for child victims of sexual abuse. And essentially, in both directives, they talk about the fact that undertaking an individual assessment, the assessment should take into account personal characteristics of the victim. And obviously the circumstances of the crime, but really kind of the special circumstances of each victim. Both of them also say you need to take into account child's views, needs, and concerns. Or in another formulation, is that individual assessments are carried out with the close involvement of the victim. On timing, this is kind of an interesting point, because in the Victims' Rights Directive, of course, says that individual assessments should be carried out at the earliest possible, or at the earliest opportunity, excuse me, so that you identify risks to the victim. And they also say that they should be updated throughout the criminal proceedings as necessary. We all know criminal proceedings can sometimes be very protracted. So not only should you stop and look at the circumstance of a child at the beginning, but you need to really consider, are there aspects of the criminal proceedings that you need to think about, again, in light of their circumstances and what might have changed in their circumstances. So, you know, again, it's a process. It's not a one step. It's not a tick the box. Over to Iceland for a question.
Yeah, hi. So the date on this, or the number, the year is both 2012. Is it the same?
So those two, thank you for the question. Those two both come from that directive. I was seeing that as well. And the paper that we'll send will also contain a little profile. Just to say that we also have a promise compendium of law and authoritative guidance. So all of the laws are kind of set out there, and there's a profile of individual assessment provisions there as well. So yeah. Thanks for checking in on that. So we're going to leave the law for the moment. That's just to give a feel for the parameters of the obligation. You know, that the obligations, you know, do tell us what the assessment, what's the scope of the assessment, that a child should be involved in it, when it should be done. And then the next thought we had was to share with you the focus standards, which we conceived of as a tool for improving these assessments, and in particular, improving the system for carrying them out. Now, just to say, I mentioned already, it was an EU-funded project. I mentioned that Terre des Hommes led it, and it included Child Circle and SAPI, who amongst other partners, I mentioned Child Circle and SAPI because we're involved in Promise projects, of course. So that's the overlap. And we were looking at this broad obligation to undertake individual assessments, that should say assessments, when a child is a victim of crime. And thinking about how the standards can help us to improve assessments. Now, again, when we stood back in focus, we weren't obviously looking at Barnahus in particular. And in fact, we were looking at both child victims and children who are suspects and accused. because as we said, under EU law, there's an obligation to carry out an individual assessment of these children's situations. And of course, in the case of a victim, that individual assessment feeds into how you respond to their needs as victims and what kind of safeguards you might put in place in a criminal investigation and in a court proceeding, for example, to take account of their specific needs as children. When children or suspects are accused, you're looking at their individual circumstances, also to think about what support and assistance they might need, or special safeguards, or procedural adaptations in the context of the criminal proceeding, but also to help think about what kind of educational and social measures should be put in place, both pre-trial and indeed after the trial. So the individual assessment is really there to understand what the child's situation is, and then it feeds into every kind of stage. And I mean, in broad terms, you know, we all know that children have rights during criminal proceedings, but they need help to access their rights. We also know that many professionals have a role in the criminal proceedings, and indeed the child protection proceedings, and sometimes other proceedings that run in parallel and often kind of intersect. We know that the personal circumstances of children vary greatly. Children aren't, you know, a homogenous group, even if we get to kind of ages, origin, particular characteristics. So we really do need to, you know, think of each child and what they might need. We know that different measures may be involved depending on the child. And we also know that information will be required at different moments of the investigation. So like bearing all of this in mind, these broad features of the criminal proceedings, we know that the individual assessment in this massive wheel, sorry, I think I enlarged it a bit too much to make sure it was readable. I hope it is legible. But basically, it kind of serves as a gateway into the criminal justice proceedings. You have this individual assessment, you stop, you look at their situation, and that really provides the right way, the way into a proceeding that will be adapted for their needs. The assessment functions to feed information to all the professionals involved. That in turn allows the coordination that's needed, and it consistently keeps the child in focus as the individual assessment is a process. Now, in Technicolor glory, these are the general standards, the guiding principles that we set out in focus. And just to, we will send you references to the website. There are a number of materials guiding you through the actual standards and other resources and how they're used. But basically, obviously, the first is that, and sorry, just to say, they may sound general, but they are accompanied, just as the promised Barnahus standards are, these general standards that are accompanied by indicators to help you kind of think about, well, I know what I should be doing and am I doing it? But this is the broad overview of the standards. I'm going to leave them there for a moment. Because I'm going to come back to the problems they were all designed to address. So I'll stop at each standard, but maybe relating it to a problem we saw. And that in a moment. The point of our aims in creating these standards was that they would serve as real foundation stones for building individual assessment processes. And obviously they would stand as kind of guidance for all the different actors that might be involved in doing individual assessments and using them and understanding how they should be used. So they were there to assist both in the development of the system itself and also help improve practice of using the standards. So they can be used by all practitioners who may have a role in individual assessments, or indeed a role in responding to the situation of a child victim. Obviously, the point about EU creating general obligations is that it's down to the member states to implement them in line with their national systems. And as we all know, each national system has different features. So the standards were very much designed as general principles, which all models can fulfill. And as I said, they provide indicators to encourage people to do certain things. As I said, they're general principles, but they weren't abstract. They were very much focusing on assisting to ensure practical progress. Okay, and we had an assessment tool that just allows you, individuals to use it or groups to use it, to use these standards and reflect together. Okay, what could we, how are we fulfilling these particular rights or principles, if I put it that way. Now, as I said, I just wanted in relation to each of the standards, they were designed to address key problems that we saw in the whole process of individual assessments. So when we talked about having holistic or kind of a comprehensive approach, looking at the whole of the situation of the child and looking at the full picture of the child, that was because often we see that any individual assessment can be very limited in scope and purpose. And it was interesting to see across Europe in some jurisdictions that kind of individual assessment was done more deeply for child suspects and accused, but less for child victims. And in some countries, it was the other way around. But what we really did feel was that you needed, of course, an individual assessment to capture as much as possible about the child. We also thought that in designing individual assessments, you had to have an inclusive approach. In other words, your assessment process should be reaching out to all different kinds of children, including, for example, younger children or children with special needs, or children who may need translators. But the point is, anytime you have an individual assessment system, it must be designed in an inclusive way. Unsurprisingly, it should be participatory because we often saw that processes were about children, but didn't really involve them. And that's something we're all familiar with as well. In terms of them occurring through a child-centered process, that comes kind of right back into one of the key areas of Barnahus, that it happens not in an intimidating or hostile setting, but that this individual assessment would happen in a place where the child is comfortable. Again, one of the problems was that you sometimes saw that these assessments were just one-off steps, not updated. So a child's circumstances could change considerably and nobody was noticing and adapting and assisting. And then again, just very quickly, obviously our one principle is that they would be done in a multidisciplinary and a collaborative way. And as I said, the kind of the more ample obligation in relation to child suspects and accused does contain that obligation that it should be multidisciplinary as far as possible. And there is no reason for it to be more ample in relation to child suspects than in relation to child victims. It's just a provision that was adopted later in time when understandings were greater. That's what I think. I haven't seen anything different. The Commission didn't explain it in any different way. I think it's always really positive to notice this evolution of obligations getting, better and better in terms of, insisting on the right kind of practice to be in place. Quality, obviously, sometimes people engaging in assessments or using assessments don't have the knowledge or skills to either elicit information from the child or make sure the child is participating, or even to really draw on the implications of what the assessment information provides. And big one, properly resourced and sustainable, so that if you are carrying out individual assessments, you need to have the resources to do it properly. So again, in terms of if you have a system underpinning individual assessments, there really does need to be capacity assigned to it. Impact oriented, it may sound kind of mundane or obvious, but you know, one of the problems we saw was that you may stop and look at the situation of a child, but it wasn't contributing to outcomes for that child. So by insisting that these processes, these assessments were impact oriented, it also means you should be able to go back and measure your system and say, okay, did it contribute to better outcomes? You know, so it kind of allows you to, it kind of insists on accountability, as it were, within the system. And progress oriented. In other words, we often saw that you might have an individual assessment, but with the best will in the world, you would want that to inform better outcomes. But you need to connect it with the ability to achieve those outcomes. So our systems must be oriented towards progress. So very much, that was like a really short overview. Really inviting you to read more deeply into those standards, how we articulate them, and the indicators we provide. Because I think, as I said, they shouldn't be abstract. I hope we design them to be of concrete use, even to the extent that potentially some of this is very obvious to you, but the standards may help convey things to other stakeholders with whom you want to forge common understandings on these processes. So lots of different ways they can be used in your hands or the hands of someone else. And again, no surprise, when you stand back and say, okay, there's a system, it's not one-off, it's multidisciplinary, it should achieve certain things. Obviously, we feel that it's not a one step, it's a process, and therefore it needs to be underpinned by the right kind of law, policy, procedures, coordination, tools and practices, skilled professionals, specific resources, and as I said, accountability mechanisms. And that's not to overcomplicate what sounds like a simple obligation. It's to make sure that it can achieve what it's intended to achieve. We touched on this, that the standards can be used to raise awareness of the obligation, to support assessments of systems, to support their development, the development of the processes, and help professionals to work together, including supporting individuals in their own roles, as well as, you know, providing a means for people to share information either across the different processes in the country or between countries. So within the Promise Network, you know, in having conversations about individual assessments, having these standards allow us to kind of focus in on particular features that we might want to improve. For example, take that whole notion of, making sure that there is accountability, like seeing what happens in Barnahus to really follow up on whether a child's specific needs are identified and met. So I would like to pause for a moment. I'm going to ask Sylvia, is there anything in the chat that we could maybe best address now, or should I continue to maybe just go into this last section of the presentation, and then maybe we can just come back into plenary rather than staring at the PowerPoint. Again, I mentioned that the focus standards were obviously very mindful of the excellent practice in Barnahus on child-centered processes, you know, and the whole point of like having an assessment where actors come together and collaborate is like at the heart of Barnahus's whole process, you know. So, I mean, we're very mindful of that. And as an example of one of the standards on multidisciplinary and collaborative nature of the standards, all of this would be very, very familiar to you, that there should be different professionals involved, that there should be protocols for coordination, case management meetings, protocols for data sharing. So, I mean, these are all things where the Barnahus, each of these are things the Barnahus has to think about in its practice, and we do it in different ways and in different degrees, to different degrees of success. But it's very much on our radar, and it's very much part of how we want to operate. So although the focus standards, of course, drew inspiration from us as a good practice, we need, must, of course, always challenge ourselves to do better within our own services and in this criminal justice system as a whole. And I mentioned that, of course, we did a couple of years ago survey our practices. And again, thank you to those who took the time to answer, because it really helped our thinking during the course of this project. And also as we designed elements to look at in other projects, and come to that in a moment. And if we were just to think about kind of potential areas for improvement, and this is not comprehensive, this is just kind of a little bit of brainstorming. Do we need to better involve the children and give them an opportunity and, help them access their rights through the individual assessment processes? I mean, to what extent are we really kind of giving children information and saying, look, we need to look at your situation, help us understand, what your situation is. Let's talk about what you might need. So are we involving children, including them, and that would involve maybe having adequate information and support at that step. We often have support for a child, but when does it come in? What do we engage the child on? Are we engaging them at that very first moment? We want to focus in on your situation and your needs in general terms, not just the experience that has brought you here. So, if we do have, assessment protocols, do they explicitly say, let's take the child's view into account, seek their consent or those of parents or people exercising responsibility where necessary? I mean, again, because the individual assessment, another area potentially for improvement, I mean, the individual assessment should help us like in our simultaneous preparation of different processes. So like when we do that first step of trying to understand the child, are the questions we're asking maybe primarily thinking of one process, like, the actual forensic interview, or are we thinking longer already about the kind of therapeutic needs? So in the individual assessment, when we encounter a child, when we look at their situation, are we thinking of all the 4 rooms, if we can put it that way? And again, just coming back to it, like I remember very much the very clear example given in Iceland when we had that professional networking exchange, that obviously, one of the first steps was to see whether a translator was needed or what kind of communication aids would help in the forensic interview. So that was very much, they were looking at that first step. In the paper that we will share, we'll just also at that point share some of the reflections we heard in the survey about the value of these assessments, what information typically Barnahus did or did not get as the child was referred in. In other words, had social services maybe already got the information and that was handed to Barnahus, or how the information on the child's situation was pieced together, both from before the Barnahus and as the child came in. What kind of tools and processes were used? Some Barnahus were saying, well, we do have a questionnaire, and we might involve an adult in support. Sources of information, obviously you've got the child, you can talk to the child, family members, in what circumstances do you need to hear from other actors, whether it's social services, whether it's potentially educators or others. Time pressure. I think I remember and are really very much focusing on the fact that, of course, like often you get into that moment of pressure when law enforcement really are keen to get into the forensic interview. So that moment of stop, let's see what the child needs. You know, there's always, you know, that need to navigate those different time pressures, taking the time to examine the situation of the child and what they need, and, you know, navigating that pressure in the criminal procedure to really dig into the investigation. And again, we thought a little bit about how the assessments were used. So again, just to leave you with a few questions, we've talked about how to improve children's engagement and their family members, how to improve, you know, balancing the professional confidentiality with the best interest of the child, this whole fraught issue of if we do individual assessments in a multidisciplinary way, what information are we sharing together? What consent are we getting from the child? And also kind of thinking all the time about how the assessment is used concretely throughout the process, before, during, and beyond the Barnahus. Like, what do we learn about the child in the Barnahus that is part of what others should know to support the child in the future? We near an end of the presentation. I just wanted to say a few words on the fact that we are very keen after Promise 3 to continue strengthening our practice on individual assessments. And I think if I think Olivia's here, and Olivia, you might like to say a word, I don't know whether it would be premature, but on the revision of the Promise Barnahus standards, and the fact that we are also kind of bringing individual assessments a little into focus. Olivia, would that be a moment? Or otherwise? Thank you.
Yes. As you know, we are currently working to review the standards. And one of the standards that we are looking at this moment is Standard 5, which focuses on joint case management. And the thought is based on this piece of work in Promise, but also surveys and discussions that we've had with the network and project partners, is to introduce a specific standard on individual assessment, drawing on the legal obligations that Rebecca has been talking about, but also the experience that Rebecca has referred to in terms of the gaps and how they might be addressed. So what I will do is that I will paste the current proposed standard into the chat, and it follows the approach that we have had before of being general but specific, and even more specific in the indicators. So I will also, in my next message in the chat, paste the indicators. And this is not the moment to get into a conversation about the formulations, but I would welcome any feedback that you might have. You can write to me if you want to, but obviously I will also take into account the discussions that we may have here today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Olivia. So again, that's a really important channel for our work in strengthening the assessments together and the practice together. We also, in new projects that are coming down the line in Promise. And Shauna, I didn't know whether maybe, did you want to say a word about some of the new projects, or in particular maybe Promise Elpis, since we were talking about that?
Sure, maybe we can stop sharing screen.
Yes, and I know you're quite right. And I thought that as well when Olivia was speaking. I apologize for that. I'll just say that the three pillars are Promise standards, the shining a light in Promise training, and then of course we want to see that we are a link in the broader picture, and that we're also doing through our projects as well. So I am delightedly stopping sharing. Thanks. So
Thanks
maybe
so
over
much.
to you, Sian.
Yeah, so for people who are here today that will join us at the General Assembly, then you'll get more information about we have an agenda item to sort of go through the key things to know about all of the projects that are starting now, so that you'll have more information about what they are doing and how to be involved. But the project that Rebecca just mentioned is specifically looking at how to adapt all of the processes in Barnahus, specifically for cases of online child sexual violence. And so this means we're looking at all 4 rooms, and of course, the individual assessment will be a part of this, because as you mentioned in your presentation, Rebecca, the situation of the child can change rapidly, and that is, of course, the case for cases of online sexual violence, especially in cases where, let's say that the child goes to Barnahus, but they have no idea that there's any material out there on the internet about them at all. And so that's a whole extra layer to be considered, and which can change rapidly and need extra considerations at all of the steps. So that one is particularly exciting, and we're looking forward to engaging with all of our members on the parts of that project that will be most interesting and relevant for you to take a part in.
Thank you so much, Shauna. And indeed, another element, as I mentioned, I think in particular in Promise Elpis, but also in others, is the kind of after the Barnahus moment, which Linda Johnson has been kind of thinking about. So, which also is, as we said, the carry forward of the continuation of individual processes, individual assessments, updating them, understanding what we learn. So in the knowledge that data sharing is going to be a big issue, and we're going to be thinking about that, but there is this obligation, it exists, so we'll have to make our way through it. So there will be challenges, but also great opportunities. Love to hand it over to the floor for questions or reflections or suggestions or experiences. And we have, I think, just under 15 minutes, if I'm not mistaken. And thank you, by the way, for your attention.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. So if you'd like to make a comment or ask a question, you can use the raise your hand feature, and then we'll get to you. Lisa.
Thank you. I apologize for not turning on my camera. I'm down with a flu, and I don't want to shock you all by having to look at me at my current state. I'd like to comment on this individual assessment aspect. I guess in Finland, we are in a lucky position in a way, because our Barnahus units have a law that gives them access to a variety of information that they can then also share with other authorities. But the issue that we are dealing with currently is that this all somehow happens before the child is interviewed for the first time, but then after the child's interview, it all kind of seems to crumble apart a bit, and no one is responsible of taking into consideration the child's needs post-interview, even though the criminal process itself might take, at least in Finland, quite a long time still after the child has been interviewed. So before the perpetrator is interviewed, before the parents or other witnesses have been interviewed. And so the situation, like when Child Protective Services are involved, they of course handle this role quite well, but they are not always involved. So the kind of cooperation of authorities, the sharing of information, and taking care of the child's individual needs after the initial interview of the child is an issue, and maybe something that we should think about. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that, Lisa. Does this Who else here has that same reflection? You can either physically raise your hand or just write yes in the chat if that sounds familiar in your country, or if not, what where is your current biggest barrier to meeting these focus standards?
Maybe as you mull it over, and thanking Lisa for the point, it also reminds me, and I don't know whether Anna O'Reilly is still with us, but I remember the point you made again when we spoke of this in the past, is that, you know, also once the criminal proceeding is, that when the needs of the criminal proceedings are met, or maybe when there's a decision that there won't be a prosecution, people may be familiar with the situation that then the services are no longer available to the child victim, that there's a risk that if the criminal prosecution steps away. So again, it resonates, I think, with Lisa's point about, yeah, it can, the individual assessment takes place and it crumbles a little bit or risks crumbling. Is that still your perspective a little bit, Anna, or does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does, and I think I would agree. I'm desperately searching through the different materials to see if there's a template, because I'm thinking, whoop, a template would be wonderful if we could steal one of those and try. So I'm not aware in Scotland that we've got any consistent template for this type of assessment, but I would agree with the previous person that the focus tends to be on getting it right for the joint interview. And then it's very ad hoc if they go to court. And I would say the kind of emphasis on a need for an individual assessment almost falls away really rapidly if a case doesn't proceed, unless there are clear child protection grounds which would see a child in that system. But increasingly, those two decisions are a bit linked.
Yeah. Thank you.
I see that we have Emma Andersson here from Stiftelsen Allmänna Barnhuset, and they are one of the actors in Sweden who is promoting this after Barnahus model of following up of the child. I'm wondering if you have any reflections on how your current model and how it's being applied in Sweden right now in relation to the conversation we're having today.
I'm sorry if my voice isn't that clear because I'm also having a flu at home, but I'll try to make myself understood anyway. I think I can agree about this, the same thoughts about the focus on before the interview and not the follow up what needs for the child after being interviewed or the forensic interview. And I think what you're talking about is this that we call after the interview in Sweden, yeah, efter barnförhöret in Swedish, yes. And that's where the social services can come in directly after being interviewed. It's a child, and two persons meet with the child, one with the parents to talk to them about the forensic interview, what they've done, and how it's happened, and then also how they can talk to the child afterwards and not asking a lot of questions and just be there for the child. And then they go for a home visit in this model together. Two persons from the social services, open care, go home to meet with the family and the child. One with the child and one with the parent, and then joint talk about like the process of being at Barnahus and the forensic interview, and to handle like those questions around what's happened today and how to meet the child's needs directly after. And then, of course, the model also includes some some support afterwards in the crisis support. And then after that, they can suggest if they need more further treatment. But that's like for physical abuse mostly. So it's not for all cases of abuse. Was that what you thought of?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Keith, you have a comment?
Thanks very much. Yeah, my name is Keith O'Reilly. I'm director of one of the sexual abuse units based in Dublin in Ireland. This is actually, I think for a lot of us, this is actually our first webinar because we've just actually signed up the promise very recently. So thanks very much. It's been really, really useful and really rich to hear about, about this piece of work. And maybe just to, seeing as we have an opportunity, maybe, for us to share a little bit about the assessments that we currently undertake. So we currently provide assessments to children where we meet up with children and their family and parents, where referrals come into us from child protection and other agencies. And really the nature of the assessment is to try and obtain as much information about the child's experience of what has occurred, particularly around sexual abuse aspects. And then within that, we have a therapeutic assessment where we make a therapeutic assessment of the child and also the family. And then we may refer on both within our own service and also to other services as well. And while we're not a criminal justice service, we do very much have an interface with the criminal justice system. And we very much do try to, operate a service where the child's individual needs are very much kept in mind and respected. So I really wanted to just share that, as well as maybe introducing ourselves as a new Irish contingent as such, just to bring people up to date on that. And we're really looking forward to joining these sessions as they continue. Thanks.
Thank you very
Thanks
much.
so much. And welcome to Children's Health Ireland.
Very much.
We have just 2 minutes left. Rebecca, do you want to use this time to sort of sum up what happens next, or?
Yeah, I mean, very simply, I mean, the standards, I think, that Olivia mentioned are really a nice next moment to think about these things in your own setting and kind of generally, and what would help you in your setting. I kind of find just in what Keith was describing as well, the notion of like where it's appropriate and proper, you have the child and you have the parent. And not only is this a moment where you can have a window into the child's life, but it also can offer a window for the child and the parent into the process. So I think, for example, in situations where a child's needs risk going unfulfilled because a criminal proceeding falls away, it also means that maybe parents and children are better equipped to kind of consider, okay, well, what do I have a right to? Because you have a right on, to these services. So to be more involved themselves. So it's an empowering moment as well. And that's an element that it would be nice to think about. But again, just to suggest that we would welcome enormously any comments, thoughts. This is a live conversation. We are ending Promise 3, but we're taking it with us into a number of new Promise projects and activities that will go on. So I just want to say thank you already for contributing and listening, and it's lovely to be in a room with you all.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, and thanks everyone for joining us today for such an interesting presentation and conversation. And as Rebecca mentioned, the conversation will continue in many different ways in the coming years. I hope that you all have a great afternoon. If you have any further questions after this meeting, please feel free to email us, and we'll be sure, if something comes up, in a few hours or in a few days that you realized, oh, I should have asked that, just jot it down in an email and we'll take it forward. And the presentation and the recording will be posted in the webinars section of barnahus.eu, either later today or early tomorrow. So check that out very soon. and we're looking forward to more. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.